Welcome to the Recruiter Startup Podcast. My name's Dualta, and in this podcast series, I will be interviewing investors, advisors, entrepreneurs, and recruiters who are based all over the world, and we will be discussing how to set up, scale, and operate a world-class recruitment company. Now, if we were to create the perfect archetypal recruiter, maybe they'd have a good educational background, they'd be a professional athlete, and then they'd join one of the major firms and go through the ranks, join their competitors, do the same thing, and then go and play a major part in a startup. And that's what today's interview is about. So I interviewed Brad Knox, who's the global head of client development and managing director of the Americas for Proco Commodities, who are part of the Proco Global Group. And we discussed his career and what he's learned. So I hope you all enjoy it. He's worked for Page, he's worked for Walters before Proco, and he's been in the industry since the early 90s. So he's had a fast and aggressive rise to the top, and we could all learn a lot from listening to him. Hope you enjoy. Brad Knox, welcome to Recruiter Startup. How are you?
Yeah, good morning. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Now, before I start, may I say that I've got real envy on your name. What a Hollywood name that is.
Well, interesting you say that. I mean, after spending a lot of time sort of growing up in Australia and then over in New York, Hollywood eventually called. So it's been 2.5 years in LA. I haven't booked any gigs just yet, but the name goes along with it.
Performing at an office near you. Wonderful. All right. So how we normally do this, Brad, is you've had a long and storied career and you've packed a lot into it. So firstly, not too many Australians jump into recruitment. I've been over there. They struggle to get them in. What brought a top graduate like yourself into our industry?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. So I finished university in Melbourne, and I actually was with the Australian Institute of Sport for Triathlon. So grew up in Melbourne, traveled to the Gold Coast in Queensland, and spent 2 years traveling, racing around the world. Got back to Melbourne, and ironically saw an ad in the paper, and the advertisement was, sales and marketing graduate wanted. Do you think outside the square? And typical classic recruitment, the advertisement was inside a square, and it was advertised by Michael Page, and a buddy of mine worked for Page at the time, and I straight away rang him and said, opportunity, sales and marketing graduate, I think outside the square, international opportunities available. This is great. Is it Nike? Is it Adidas? Like, this sounds fantastic. He said, it's actually with us doing recruitment. So something I hadn't necessarily thought about during my time at university, but a sudden 8 interviews later, and I was working for Michael Page.
And that's in Melbourne, is it?
Correct, yes.
What was recruitment like then in Australia in 2002? Was it pretty much an untapped market? Or I'm sure it was dramatically different to what it is today.
Yeah, I think because we didn't have the technology like LinkedIn and that sort of thing. So what you probably found was that there were 3 or 4 major players in the market, and they pretty much had a monopoly share. The market I started in was more of a sort of suburban sort of market. So I started my recruitment career at Michael Page in Melbourne, looking after the northeastern suburbs. So a lot of manufacturing, a lot of logistics, and it was one of those sort of markets where Page wasn't necessarily that well known in that particular market, so it was a bit of a grind. But in saying that, Page at the time was one of the premier recruiters in Australia, and we did have decent market share across the country, so it made it a little bit easier with the infrastructure that we had in place and the candidate database we had. But definitely a different landscape to what it is now.
What was it like back then? Were you in a room full of pommies? Is that that what you?
Yeah, look, there was a lot of internationals, but I think what Michael Page did really well, back in the early 2000s was that they hired really top tier graduates. So they had a program where they sort of built from the ground up to sort of foster that culture and really develop that sort of page or die type mentality. So it was a combination. We had a few British guys in the office, but then we had a lot of top tier graduates from a number of the first class universities in Melbourne as well.
Okay, I think a lot of firms struggle to attract those top graduates now. Was recruitment maybe, I don't know, a better option for graduates back then, or is it just there's more recruitment firms out there vying for all their signatures right now?
Yeah, it's probably a combination. I think when I joined, I feel like in the early 2000s, Michael Page Melbourne really was the gold standard, and we had people. There was a guy that I worked with that I remember had sort of done 3 years as a cadet at PwC straight out of high school and finished his degree and actually left to come to Michael Page. So we were attracting guys out of Goldman Sachs, people out of PwC, in combination with a number of top tier graduates. So I really feel like it was a legitimate professional services business that was attracting the best people.
How long did it take you to get good at it?
Well, it was an interesting one. I sort of got thrown straight into the fire because when I started, I actually worked for the now CEO of Australia. So he was a senior director. Because it was a greenfield market that I was thrown into, it really was a single type scenario. So working for a senior guy coming straight into the business and working in a market that was not necessarily defined really forced me to sort of I suppose get good quickly. And I think sort of having that background in triathlon and sort of spending 7-8 hours a day, 6 days a week training, just taking that mentality and that discipline into an office environment for me worked really well. Were
you able to continue your training?
No, it was a straight blunt answer. It was one of those interesting things where I think that when you're sort of competing at an elite level in any sport, it really takes 100% of your energy and effort. And so I think that mentality that I took into triathlon, I just transitioned into recruitment. So I was the guy that was there at 8 a.m, there at 8 o'clock at night, sort of 6-7 days a week to sort of establish that market that I was initially given.
And did you move through the ranks quite quickly as a result?
Yeah, I did. So I was sort of fortunate enough to win a couple of awards at Michael Page for sort of Researcher of the Year and then Consultant of the Year. And I think sort of within 3.5 years, I moved from a researcher in the northeastern suburbs to running our corporate business in the central business district, looking after 3 or 4 of our major accounts. And so I was fortunate enough to sort of transition pretty quickly up the ladder.
How did you find that, like going, because you were still a young chap, like were you managing people who were much older than you, or was there any issues with that?
Yeah, initially there was, because you're right, I was managing people that were older than me, and I think the biggest transition that I needed to make when I was first approached about a leadership role was, I think when you start out and it's about being successful and trying to be number one, it's a very self-centered and very selfish sort of approach. And then I think once you transition to that leadership group, it becomes about more than just yourself, and it comes about giving that care and that attention to other people. So that was one of the transitions I went from, sort of being in an individual sport like triathlon, then going into sort of a sole contributor type role at Michael Page, and then sort of transitioning from that into a leadership role. That was one of the mentalities that I just had to get over. But for me it was it was a fantastic transition, and I think you know that that's the path you want to go down when you get more excited about your people doing well than your own personal self. So that was one of the things that I found, and challenging managing people older than you. But I think very quickly, if you're able to lead by example and show the individuals that work with you that you're in the trenches there with them, I mean, you gain that respect pretty quickly.
You sound like a hyper competitive person. Like you've gone from like high level sport into recruitment. You've done really well. Then you're into managing people. Were you able to channel that competitiveness against other leaders in the business? Is that what you kind of use to spur yourself on?
Yeah, I don't think it was ever against other people in the business. I think that and I think that's the mistake that sometimes people make in the workforce, and I think that athletes make as well. They focus so much on what the competition is doing, and they forget to focus on themselves. So one of the things that I learned very quickly transitioning into the business and transitioning into recruitment is that you at that early age, you get set pretty rigid KPIs, you had set objectives, and it's just about being the best you can be and challenging yourself to be better. And I think for me, that was probably what really sort of got me going and got me enthusiastic about it, was just being the best I could be more than sort of competing against other people.
How do you deal with people who aren't as driven as you?
It's a really good question, because I think that what I've learned, I think maybe when I was a little younger and probably a little less mature, if you can call me mature now, so some of the guys in the office may debate that. But I think that initially you go into it thinking that everybody has the same level of drive and the same level of ambition, and you very quickly realize that people have different motivations.
I've only listened to you for 8 minutes, and I can tell you that you've got way more drive than 90% of the people I speak to.
Yeah. So I mean, you very quickly realize that people have different objectives in life, they have different motivations, they have different drivers, and I think there's a position for everybody. So I think it's not necessarily about getting people to operate at the same level as you, or with the same level of enthusiasm or drive. It's about getting the best out of them and helping them fulfill their potential. And some people, as I said, everyone has different motivations, whether it be a mother returning to the workforce that wants to work 3 days a week, or whether it be a young hungry graduate that wants to work 20 hours a day. So I think it's not about a one hat fits all type methodology. It's all about sort of recognizing people's different skills and different attributes, and really sort of playing towards those.
Being in those big environments, there's almost like an indoctrination that comes with being in there. The culture of those organizations are put on you from day one, the values, and it's your day is almost rehearsing the value proposition of the business throughout the day. What do you think it is that really works from, like, you stayed there for 8 years? Like, what was it about that culture that gripped you so much to give up most of your 20s?
Yeah, I think they really instill a level of belief, and I think it's like any great sport team as well. I think with the leaders, they sort of grow organically, so the leaders they have within the business are quite aspirational, and you see them starting at the bottom and working their way to the top of the ladder, and I think they give you that real belief that you can follow them down that same path. And it really is an us versus them type mentality that they breed, and I think that's probably what grips people and what keeps people in the business.
So us versus them, you know who them is, right? The biggest them is is where you went. So I want to jump into that move in a second, but if you went through the ranks, how did that look over the 8 year? Was it like associate, senior, manager? Did you go into direct, like, were you managing multiple offices quite quickly?
Yeah, so the way that it worked, and I suppose to take a step back from that, I always had a innate drive to want to live in the US. My parents relocated to New York in the late 90s. So it was something that always sort of drove me, and that's sort of what got me into recruitment in the first place, was that opportunity to go and work in New York for Michael Page. So, I spent, the process of me getting from Melbourne to New York took a little longer than I would have liked, but I got given the opportunity in a leadership capacity in Melbourne, which kept me in Melbourne for a couple of years longer than what was initially anticipated. So, I started as a researcher, became a consultant, then became a team leader, and then became a manager in Melbourne. That all happened within about 4 years, 3.5, 4 years. And sort of the stipulation of moving into that leadership role was that I would stay sort of, a certain period in Melbourne to manage and lead the team. Eventually, I got the opportunity to transition to New York, where I managed the corporate finance and accounting group. So I had a large group of individuals that I was managing there. I was in New York for probably about 18 to 24 months. And, the individuals who I'd sort of worked for as a graduate when I first joined Michael Page in Melbourne had ascended to quite senior leadership roles in Australia. and they offered me an opportunity that was almost too good to refuse to come back to Sydney. So whilst I dare say my wife and I were probably not quite at a point emotionally where we wanted to come back to Australia, the opportunity for us to come back was too great. So
let me jump in.
Sure.
Let's regress into that New York experience. So you're over there. You did 2 years. What was the biggest, like, was there any on-the-job learning that you had to do? Because I know both marketplaces, and they're very different, especially what Melbourne's like compared to New York. I can imagine the pace of work, the different style of relationships, and all of that. How did you navigate that in those 2 years?
Yeah, I would say that it was obviously a much bigger scale. Like everything was on a much grander scale. Things were quicker, but I think the business was also in a very different position. When I felt that when I was in Melbourne, Michael Page really was the blue. It was really the gold standard. I think they'd been well established. They were a market leader. Their systems and processes were super slick. When I transitioned to Michael Page in New York, they'd just gone through a massive growth spurt where I think the business went from 30 people to close to 200 people in the space of about 12 months. So there were a lot of new people, and I think the business had been around for about 10 years, and it had probably failed to meet the expectations of senior leadership. So I think they'd hit that critical juncture where it was all about scaling up in a very aggressive and a very fast-paced manner. So I wouldn't say that in terms of managing client relationships and actual recruitment, definitely more competitive than Melbourne, but I'd say the core fundamentals of what we do weren't all that together different. I think probably the biggest difference that I noticed was just in the organization itself, in terms of the mechanisms, the behaviors, and I suppose just the pace at what they were growing. And I think going from a marketplace where you're one of 3 or 4 big players that almost have a monopoly on the market in Melbourne to a market where New York, where you have hundreds of recruiters and it's a very fragmented marketplace, and the loyalty is not always there. It was a very interesting transition.
So you went back to, was it Sydney you went to then?
Yeah, then I transitioned back to Sydney. So
what year was that?
That was 2008.
Oh, here we go. Walk me through this. This is always my favorite bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I came back, the economy was still strong. So I initially came back to manage Michael Page's Sydney team within the sort of finance and accounting group. So we had a group of about 35, 40 odd people. And then it was at a time where we also were launching Page Personnel. So I was an integral part of that leadership team that launched Page Personnel in Australia. So I sort of took on responsibility for Sydney, Chatswood, and also Parramatta. So I had multiple offices, and all of a sudden the economic crisis hit Australia. So probably early mid 2009. So it's one of those periods where we weren't quite sure where the revenue line was growing. So the only thing we really could control at that point in time was our cost base, which is obviously your people. So it was a pretty harrowing experience going through that, where we significantly right-sized the business within a very short period of time, which it was definitely an interesting lesson learned.
You weren't billing at this stage. You were off the tools, were you?
Pardon me?
Were you still billing as part of your role?
Yeah, I think I've got a fantastic mentor, a guy by the name of Matt Cook, who runs his own boutique now in Melbourne. But Matt was the managing director for Australia at Michael Page until recently. And one of the things that Matt instilled in all of his leadership team was that even when you're managing and running large scale groups, it's still important to be a contributor to the business. So whilst I was managing multiple offices, I was also responsible for generating relationships, placing senior level roles, and sort of helping that filter down through the business. So I probably wore 2 different sorts of hats there.
So that's really good. That's kind of unique. I usually find in those businesses, people were really aspirational to get out of billing and to move further away from that. But you obviously seen that you were still a value add if you were billing as well.
Well, I think it just sets the tone for the business as well. I think that obviously there comes a certain point in time where you do need to stand up and sort of separate yourself, and your role does become a little bit more strategic, and it becomes more about sort of leading and mentoring people, and also helping set the strategic direction of the business. But I think if you're able to also get down into the trenches and show your value add, I think that just really sets the standard for everybody else in the group.
You you must have managed a lot of top performers in your time. What do you think sets them apart from the people who just kind of drift in and out of the business?
Yeah, definitely a lot of unique personalities, and I mean, I've had $1 million billers. Some of them super engaging. They're all about the business. They want to be a part of everything. They're super engaged. Others, they come to work, they sit there for 14 hours a day, they do their job, and then they walk out and they don't talk to anyone. So I don't know whether there's any sort of specific personality that really works well in terms of generating revenue. But I think the one underlying value that sort of runs through all of them is just their commitment and their dedication to actually being successful and doing the job.
The next move, you got obviously headhunted by RW. Was that a tough move for you to make? The enemy, the oldest enemy. What? Yeah. Moving from like Page to Walters is like Man U to Liverpool, isn't it?
Yeah, it's at the time it was pretty significant as well. I mean, I was Michael Page through and through, and I think if you'd have asked me probably 6 months before the move actually happened whether I'd ever leave Michael Page, my answer would have been no. But I think there were personal issues involved as well. My wife and I really wanted to head back to New York. I think that we felt that 2 years just wasn't quite enough. And although the draw in Australia was the job opportunity, I think ultimately we had to follow our hearts and sort of go back to the US. And I think it was one of those things where for me, I probably didn't see it as really joining the enemy in New York, even though it probably was, because Robert Walters had sort of been this 6 or 7 person business in Manhattan. It was purely related to financial services. Their business model compared to the rest of Walters was very different because you had these 6 or 7 really well tenured guys that were all on a straight commission, only within a niche market within financial services. So the opportunity for me was to maybe sort of springboard a couple of levels that I would have had to have gone through at Michael Page to actually sort of lead a country and lead a region and be involved with a startup within a much broader business. So when I moved to New York, it was just financial services, and I was sort of given the opportunity to build out, luxury retail, marketing, sales, finance, accounting, legal, and compliance. So for me, it was really like a blank slate to go over there and sort of, build a business, but then also integrate that with the broader Walters network across the globe.
And look, it's a very important office. Robert Walters himself launched that office, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. I mean, ironically, Robert actually worked for Michael Page back in the day, and I think he actually spent time with Michael Page in New York. I think it was in the late 70s or early 80s. So I think for him, it was only a short-lived experience, but I think for him, it really struck a chord. And, New York is, from my perspective anyway, is something that Rob's always been, very passionate about.
So you move over to New York. This is the first time you've really worked in a really small office. You've got a lot of experienced billers that kind of probably want you to leave them alone. And you've got a mandate to build out a business and put in a proper structure in place. How do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, culturally it was difficult. So I set up the business adjacent to that financial services business. So that continued to run under its own guise, under the MD that was looking after that. And, I think that, mentality-wise, it was a bit of a challenge initially for some of the guys to accept what we were trying to do. It was a very different way of recruitment. We were selling advertisements on our website. We were branding ads. We were paying guys on discretionary bonuses as opposed to direct commissions. But what we were doing probably more than any of that, we were really sort of creating a brand name in New York, which, for me was pretty exciting. And I think that was one of the things that for me made it not like really joining the enemy, joining Walters, because ultimately it was the opportunity for me to go and create that brand name in New York and really put my touch on it and sort of help contribute to what that brand looked like and how people perceived it in the marketplace. So yeah, initially there was a little bit of resistance. I think the guys were like, what's going on here? But I think over time we managed to sort of bring it together quite nicely, and we fostered a really good culture.
Is there, knowing what you know now and having been in the States for a while, if you could go back to that experience, is there anything that you would do any different?
Look, I think for me, I was probably a bit aggressive in that role. I wanted to grow it significantly. I had visions of having, 10, 15 offices across North America, and I was in a real hurry to get that done. So I think in hindsight, if I had my time again, I might have just slowed down a little bit and just just appreciated the opportunity for what it was. But I mean, ultimately, it was a fantastic experience. The guys were super supportive of what we were trying to achieve, and I look back fondly on that sort of 2.5 year period.
When you describe what you wanted out of that in terms of doing all those offices, it strikes me that that's what S3 did during that period, or in the period since then. Why do you think, knowing what you do about the American market, that the S3 model is more suited to it than Walters and Page?
Yeah, I think the reality with Walters, I think at the time, were probably just a little risk averse. I think that obviously Rob had seen New York firsthand and seen North America firsthand, and went sort of back in the 80s, and at the time it was really like the Wild West. So I think there was a little bit of aversion to risk, and I think at the time Walters probably saw opportunities in emerging markets, like Thailand, like the Philippines, like Vietnam, where it's a lot lower cost to entry and probably a little less risk in terms of operating in those markets, given the presence that they had in Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So, I would say that would probably be one of the things that held them back, was just that aversion to risk. I think the other difference as well is that you see some of these big players, like your Page and Walters, come into the North American market, and in smaller markets it's easy to homogenize things a little bit, and it's easy to gain sort of quick market share. I think in North America, it's such a large market, with over 300 million people and 50 different states that all operate quite independently. It's not the sort of environment where you can sort of just come in day one and decide that you're going to run a recruitment business across America. It takes a little more planning, and it's a little more intricate than what it might be in some of the smaller markets.
Yeah, it always fascinates me. We had Kieran Behan on here who heads up Faden over there now, and we walked through the journey of how they managed to really get to, I can't remember how many. It always makes me wonder, like, how did companies like S3 and those whose leadership team come from S3, why are they able to scale so well in America and not in Australia, whereas Walters and Page are so good in Australia? And I don't know if it's just the timing issue or if it's a process piece, but it's do you think investment is the key area?
Yeah, I think smart strategic investment is the key focus. I think far too often these businesses sort of come in, and I think they maybe try and treat it like their own local market and try and scale up quite significantly very quickly. Whereas I think it's just about having the right people and the right jobs. And I think if you're able to get the right individuals to lead the business, coupled with the right level of strategic investment, I think you can make it work.
So this leads us up to you joining Proco Global. Now, were you at a stage in your career where you think, maybe I want to set up my own business, maybe I want to go for something, or I want to be involved in something? Were these things that you were weighing up at this process, because you've been in the industry for a while at this stage?
Yeah, I think it had sort of got to a point for me where, my whole career I had sort of worked in, big, large global businesses. And, for me, it was, I think I'd reached that period in my career where I wanted to try something a little bit different. And, I think the way that I saw the markets going, particularly in North America, was that, businesses are really gravitating towards partnering with subject matter experts. And, for me to join a smaller organization, to be sort of hands-on again and to be involved with building something, but also to be involved with, a niche market, for me was really exciting.
And walk me through that journey. How early did you come on board? Were you the first person? Were you the first boot on the ground?
No, I wasn't. So I initially joined a business called Commodity Search Partners. Richard Paisley, who was our group CEO, was a non-executive chairman. So Richard had actually spoken to me about a job at Proco Group probably 6 months before I was ready to leave. And at the time, it wasn't quite the right fit. And then Richard approached me about 3 or 4 months after that and sort of said, look, we don't have any opportunity with us at Proco Global, but there's a business I'm the non-executive chairman for called Commodity Search Partners, and we're looking for a guy to sort of head up our business in North America. So it'll be a combination of helping set the strategic direction of the business, but also it's a contributor role as well. So you need to be involved with the market. So I think those two things really appealed to me, and with somebody like Richard as sort of the non-executive chairman and helping guide the business as well, for me was a real appeal. So 6 years ago I joined Commodity Search Partners, and we operated as Commodity Search Partners for 4 years in my tenure. When I joined the business, there was just a couple of people in North America. We had operations in Singapore and Brighton, and that was about it. And then over that four-year period, we grew relatively significantly. And then 2 years ago, we made a strategic decision to merge our business with Proco.
Okay, what was it like for you coming in to a tiny little room and leaving a machine for the first time? Was there anything that you learned in that period that surprised you?
It was definitely a culture shock.
Yeah,
I think the move to Robert Walters in New York was probably a nice halfway house for me, because going from Michael Page, where the New York office was 150 odd people plus, the Sydney office was 100 people plus, and then when I joined Robert Walters in New York, it was only 7 or 8 people. So I think for me, even though it was a big global business and it had the infrastructure behind it, it was a very small office. So I think for me, that transition to Walters for 2.5 years made the transition into CSP a lot easier for me. I think if I'd have gone straight from a Michael Page to Commodity Search Partners, it would have been a much more difficult transition. But I feel like that Robert Walters transition really helped sort of buffer things a little bit.
Now, being a rec-direct, I obviously study who moves from which companies to which, and I've seen over the years a lot of Michael Page people have moved to Proco, and I was just kind of wondering, what would you say the big differences are for somebody who's working on the shop floor at Walters or on the shop floor with your company now?
Yeah, I think it's just a different mentality. I think when you run a large business, you sort of rely on metrics and KPIs, and you rely on everybody doing a certain standard of activity every single day in, day out. And I think in that sort of environment, when you've got 3, 4, 5,000 people plus, you need to have uniformity. I think the biggest difference between that environment and our environment is that, and I know this gets said a lot, but we are a lot more entrepreneurial, and we give people the opportunity to be successful in their own way. We don't rely, whilst we have the tools to be able to pull out, metrics and, pull out data and everything like that, we're not the sort of environment that manages by metrics. So I think that's probably the biggest difference. We give people the autonomy to sort of, we give them the same sort of support and learning and development that you would get in one of the big firms, but we give them the entrepreneurial ability to be able to go out and run their own desks without sort of micromanagement.
Could you define what that is? I know you just did say what I was going to say. It does get thrown out there a lot. Just the entrepreneurial piece. Like what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I think we obviously, we have we have sort of boundaries that we operate within. So we have sort of corporate guidelines, and we have a certain standard and expectation that people reach when they're dealing with clients and candidates and things like that. However, what we also understand is that, we're dealing with people. Not everybody works the same. Different people work different ways. So whether it be flexible hours, whether it be, someone is focused more on developing clients than they are on executing searches. So what we look to do is try to play to people's strengths and give them that level of autonomy to be able to go out there and build a market. So yeah, so we'll give them the tools that they need. However, we'll let them sort of we'll give individuals that opportunity to really go out and flourish and do what they need to do in order to be successful.
Okay, and could you briefly tell us, have you seen much transition from people who've made the move from the Australian market over to join you with Proco, and the same with the UK, from competitors and all the rest? And was there any lessons learned that you could share for people who are moving into a brand new market?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of things. I mean, if I look at New York specifically as an example, I mean, it's a pretty aggressive city. It's fast paced, it's dynamic, and I think sometimes people have a utopian view of what it's going to look like. And so, I think a lot of people come over thinking that they're going to live this, this incredible lifestyle where they're not going to have to maybe work that hard and things are going to fall in their lap, and it's going to be a seamless transition. And I've seen a number of individuals across all three businesses that I've worked with in North America that you see people transitioning from the UK or from Australia with that mentality, and then they get there and it really is a rude awakening. So I would say that if you're looking to transition into the North American market, you have to really want to do it, but then you also have to be prepared to put in the effort and put in the work to be successful. And if you're not, I think you get found out pretty quickly.
What excites you most about running a recruitment business in America right now?
Look, I think it's a combination of things. I think that there's just so much opportunity in North America. I mean, the market's continually evolving. The markets are huge as well. As I said before, with 300 million people, a lot of the global corporate headquarters are based out of the US as well. So you're dealing with massive scale, but you're also dealing with a lot of businesses that have not necessarily used search firms before or have always worked in a certain way. So there's that opportunity to come in and really sort of disrupt the market a little bit and do things a little bit differently. And I think that's what excites me the most. I think there's just so much opportunity here. Without getting into the political landscape of what America looks like at the moment, the economy is seemingly sort of really pushing forward at the moment, and we're seeing a lot of positive returns from a number of our clients. So I think now is a great time to be in North America and be in the recruitment market.
And what's your plans for the business at the moment? Are you scaling out New York, Los Angeles? Are you looking to get into any new marketplaces?
Yeah, I think at the moment it's probably a combination of both. We're looking to scale out Los Angeles. We're relatively small out here in LA. We've only been out here 2 years. In New York, we're hiring across all of our different brands. So our plan over the next 2 to 3 years is to scale up quite significantly, based on sort of where we're currently at as a business. We're halfway through our financial year. We're on record pace, which is fantastic. So I think there's a lot of positive indicators for us at the moment.
All right, Brad. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and telling us a little bit about your journey in the business and all the rest. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for having me on.
Take care.
Bye.
Well, a massive thank you to Brad for coming on the podcast. It's funny, sometimes you can tell in the intonation in somebody's voice what type of a character they are. And right from the off, the way he's answering questions, how detailed he is, how quick he is to respond, you can just tell that this guy has bags of energy and gets shit done. So, real impressive character, knows his stuff, give us a good insight into the American market and what the Australian market was like back in the day, what it's like to work at big firms, and to maybe take the training wheels off and join a startup and help them grow. So he's had a really cool career. So again, massive thank you to Brad. And if any of you want to discuss with me opportunities in LA or New York with any of our clients, just hit me up. Or if you want to figure out how you could launch your own business over there, I'm happy to field those questions as well. So thank you so much for listening, and we will be back with another great podcast later in the week, hopefully.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.